So, the United States of America turns 250 years old this weekend, and by almost every hard measure, or at least how we measure power right now, it is stronger than at any other previous point in its history. The economy is the largest in the world. Its military expenditure is double that of any other country, and it's leading the development of artificial intelligence. It is the world's biggest producer of oil and gas. And yet, can we say that these metrics are really how to define the most powerful nation? Moreover, next week, NATO allies gather in The Hague for what is being hailed as one of the most consequential summits in the alliance's history. And the question on every European leader's mind walking into that room will not be about, say, Russia, Iran, or China. It will be about the United States under Donald Trump. Is it still reliable? What is America in 2026? Those sorts of questions would have been unthinkable, say, even 10 years ago. It shouldn't be thinkable now, but it is. And the gap between those things, between America's extraordinary objective strength and the genuine growing uncertainty amongst the world, let alone its closest allies, about its ability to be relied on, is what I wanted to make a video about. Because I want to give you a slightly different framing for what you probably will hear most of all amongst mainstream media. The dominant narrative being that America is declining, China is rising. That this is an inevitable shift of the tectonic plates of global power that everyone must simply adapt to, and what happens over history, as we saw from the Dutch to the British and then the British to the Americans. But I've never really always felt that that was the case. At least right now, I don't think that simple exchange of power from America to China. And I think believing it leads to catastrophically wrong conclusions. Looking at the America from the outside is that it's not necessarily a declining power. It is a dominant power choosing, be that deliberately and systematically or unintentionally, to dismantle its own instruments that have given it its massive influence. Those are very different things. Decline is something that happens to you. Retreat is a with choice. And what Trump's America is doing right now is very much retreating, isolating, withdrawing, disengaging, and arguably at the worst possible moment, not only for the NATO summit coming up, but for this more and more international disorder we inhabit. Let's break it down. This is the Global Gambit. How's it going, everyone? So this video is about the United States, 250 years old, but specifically from the perspective of power, because power is nebulous, but also synonymous with geopolitics, economics, international relations, much of what we cover on this channel. And while we mainly talk about the war in Ukraine, or most recently the war with Iran, the strategic competition, especially between the United States and China, underpins a lot of that as well. And when we think about power, we often just assume of absolute power in a military sense or economics. But there are so many other areas that it can be viewed from. And if you stick around to the end of the video, you'll find one particular, but I think often overlooked or misinterpreted distinction, which is increasingly imperative to understanding where we're going. But of course, I want to know what you guys think. So let me know in the comments your thoughts on this pretty fascinating, but sometimes hard to grasp topic. So let me be precise about what I'm saying here. Part of this video was inspired by a recent article in The Economist, as well as a couple of other pieces I've been reading in foreign policy, foreign affairs, lots of good media outlets. But I expanded on it with some of my own thoughts, which is because this matters enormously for understanding what is actually happening. As I said in the intro, decline implies that a country is losing its capacity, that its economy is shrinking, its military is weakening, its technological edge is eroding. In many ways, Russia is in decline because Putin's war in Ukraine is destroying the country from within. And that's not what is necessarily happening to America. There is varying ways that you can judge power empirically, But one study that was done in economists found that it was pretty clear. On economic, military, and technological means, America is richer, stronger, and more capable than it's ever been historically. Its GDP of $32.4 trillion is 55% larger than China's at market exchange rates. Of course, you can measure that in nominal or purchasing power parity, which is an important distinction to remember. The researchers of this piece are saying that the leading, most consequential technical development of our time in artificial intelligence is the defining factor. Its energy production of the US has also made it self-sufficient in ways it never was during the Cold War, and that's become particularly apparent in the past few months. Conversely, retreat is different. Retreat means a country that has the capacity to lead, but is choosing to internalize, choosing to withdraw from institutions that it built and established, choosing to alienate its allies cultivated over decades, choosing to dismantle the very architecture through which it exercised influence, precisely because that influence was largely invisible, diffuse, and therefore undervalued by a domestic audience that only see the costs and not the longer-term returns, the intrinsic value of what it means to have the America's alliance network, the single biggest asset I've always believed America has. But this is what America, under Donald Trump's administration specifically, is doing right now. And this confusion between decline and retreat leads to a series of catastrophic assumptions, incorrect assumptions. That if America is declining, then its withdrawal from global leadership is a symptom of inevitable change that must simply be adapted to. That if America is retreating, then its withdrawal is a choice that could be reversed and whose consequences are being actively manufactured rather than passively suffered is the point I'm making. This distinction, I think, underpins everything, at least what's happening at a very grand strategic level. But it's always largely absent from the current debate, that we sort of go through these cycles and then inevitably the leadership, the hegemon will be replaced by another one. But it's not clear that China even wants to be the global hegemon. It's quite happy benefiting from the status as it is. Indeed, it's the American-led system that led to the meteoric rise of China and its great economic boom. Does it necessarily want to take the reins over from that, or benefit from free riding to a certain extent? So to understand what is being dismantled, you of course have to understand what was built, because American dominance wasn't and has never been primarily about military or economic capability, although those are naturally imperative. It's about something more subtle and, in the eyes of many who talk about the American dream or idea of global America, is durable. That America built a world in which it values things like democracy, rule of law, free trade, human rights, and that those are the organizing principles of the international system. And it did this not primarily, say, through coercion, but through attraction, through institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, NATO, that give other countries a stake in this American-led order, through development a system that built and cultivated relationships across the global south, and through cultural exports like films, music, technology, what's otherwise known as soft power, and aspired many people to want to sort of emulate America, even those in the Soviet Union. Since 1960, America gave roughly $2 trillion in official development assistance. It helped create and spent decades developing a post-war international order that lifted global average incomes fivefold. It built these alliances in Europe and, of course, Asia that deterred larger conflicts for 80 years. Now, a lot of people will argue that this is simply hypocrisy, that the United States has preached all these things, but then been the arbitrator of some of the worst conflicts and interferences and destabilizations, think of the wars in the thousands, in history. And that to preach the idea of democracy, rule of law, humanitarianism, human rights is all well and good, but if you're not going to follow through except by yielding the largest military to your interests, then none of it is legitimate. Now, of course, the other arguments will be that this was all about American interests, that the world America built was a world in which American companies would trade freely, American currency dominated, American institutions shaped international law, and American values provided that ideological framework within which most of the world's democracies then organized themselves. Now, people argue that the genius of the system and why it's proving so hard to dismantle or see a post-American sort of system is that the thing that is almost impossible to explain to a domestic audience focused on immediate cost is that it didn't look like a system of American dominance. It looked like a genuine international order. Countries participated not because America forced them to, but because membership was largely beneficial. You'll hear me often reiterate that despite what people will say about the irrelevance of the United Nations, it's actually the Chinese that are some of the most biggest players in there, or other sort of countries that are frustrated with America's double standards, or the West's double standards more broadly, that still make a lot of effort through these institutions that America built. It's very interesting, the juxtaposition there. Then you have to be specific, of course, because the argument I'm making is not that Trump is wrong to prioritize, say, American interests. Every leader should naturally consider their country's needs and interests. But the argument is that he is fundamentally misidentifying what those interests are and pursuing a strategy that actively undermines them while believing it strengthens them. Now, none of this should come as any surprise, but take trade, for example. Trump's core claim has always been that America is exploited by the international trading system. Now, there is a bit of a truth to this. The China shock, job losses in specific American manufacturing communities following China's ascension to the WTO, for example, was real and painful for a lot of Americans. But the numbers also put it into context. Since 1960, real incomes have increased more than America in absolute terms than in any other large country, rising more than 5 times as much as India and twice as much as China. America is among countries with more than 20 million citizens, the richest on earth by nearly 20%. The post-world order that Trump is dismantling is the order that produced that prosperity. So the notion that America was purely and only exploited is actually largely backwards. Or consider migration. America's success over 250 years has been built substantially on its ability to attract talent from every corner of the world and turn it into innovation and growth. To reiterate, every country has a right to determine its migration flows, who can come into the country under what conditions. But it would be absurd to deny that America, as international and cosmopolitan as it is, has not benefited significantly from the diversity of intelligence and human capital migration that it has over the past several decades. And now, with Trump's pursuance of zero net migration, freezing research grants, or pushing scientists out of federal institutions, well, it's sort of like Brexit and the UK suffering significantly because we've seen such a loss of important and diverse, but also people with different ways of doing things. Yes, you have a very capable national workforce, but if you have someone from a different culture, a different part of the world, who does things differently, then who's to say it won't benefit the country overall? And this is where I hear the most common argument in defense of sort of American disengagement. The US has been involved in too many foreign conflicts and too much time propping up other countries' security and receiving too little gratitude in return. By pulling back, a country can rebuild domestically and stop subsidizing allies who should pay for their own security. Now, that sounds reasonable, and there is a lot of truth to it. A lot of these building up and propping up of other governments has been for American interest, and often with very nefarious and unpleasant realities behind them. But this is, I think, an issue that misses a crucial point. The theory of disengagement assumes that if America stops engaging in other regions, those regions will somehow be left alone to their own devices to prosper independently. But that is not how the world works, and it's not how opponents or competition like Russia or China think about it. Russia does not want a power vacuum in Eastern Europe. It wants to fill it. China does not want a less engaged America in the Indo-Pacific. It wants to exploit it. The withdrawal of American influence does not produce stability. It produces a competition to fill the space left by the US. And this is the part of disengagement that advocates consistently miss. The third-party countries America is now alienating, middle powers, the global south, traditional allies, are not neutral parties who will simply manage their own affairs and we live in some idealistic world. There are active agents who will make choices about which power centers to align with. A major European poll, for example, last year, headlined simply, "How Trump is Making China Great Again." Trump has convinced leading middle powers from Brazil or South Africa to India and Turkey that they are free to sign up with both China and the US simultaneously. And that's not really a victory for American leverage. That's the erosion. And the numbers are even more stark. America is now ranked the 5th most disliked country across 85 nations that were asked, more disliked than Russia or China. In soft power, America has recorded its steepest decline of all 193 nation brands, now standing less than 1.5 points ahead of China. In Canada, historically America's closest ally, positive perceptions have fallen from 52 to 19%. And in France, 73% of the population now believes America is no longer an ally, and France was America's first ally. So these are not abstract metrics. They make it harder to build coalitions, harder to enforce sanctions, harder to coordinate responses to Russia's actions over Ukraine, Chinese territorial intentions, Iran's actions across the Middle East, or even perhaps Israel's as well. And right now, more countries are choosing to work around it than at any other point since World War II. One of the biggest underpinning of America's entire global architecture and perceived system, can it survive? And if it can't, well, then what fills its place? And is anything capable of filling its place? Bottom line, everyone, the point of this video is that despite what some metrics may say, the United States is still the most powerful country. But a lot of people seem to think that when one country is rising, another is in perpetual decline or just naturally in decline. But it's not always like that. You can manage your country's decline or simply managing it at a stable level, plateauing whilst another is growing. So it looks relative like it's declining, and not necessarily that it is. In Ray Dalio's book on world cycles, he talks about the United States taking over from Britain, Britain taking over from the Netherlands, and therefore China inevitably taking over from the United States. But it's not that simple. Especially in the case of China, it's not clear what the Chinese really want. Do they want to become the global policeman, the country that has managed supply chains, maritime waterways, the protection of multiple other countries around the world, like the United States has? In many ways, they don't. Otherwise, they would be getting more military bases, more presence. Or do they simply want a more equal playing field and sort of to benefit from the world as it has been, what some people think of as a status quo power? It's these sorts of questions that people like to have definitive answers about. Yes, no, very binary. And that is very never much the case in international relations geopolitics. And if anyone claims that it is, then they usually have an agenda to push or a lack of understanding of how complex matters really are. What I've tried to do in this video is simply give a reflective interpretation of America's place in the world right now and what it's trying to figure out and where it's going. I'm not pretending to have the answers, just simply compiling lots of different points to allow you to make up your own mind. And if you enjoyed that video, then of course do subscribe for more like this from me, and like the video. It's very simple, but it helps out a lot. And watch this video on screen next for a greater, deeper dive on topics very much like this. Take care.